Japan is changing property rules for foreign buyers. This one's also fairly interesting. It seems like they're going to make it harder for foreigners to buy property in Japan. It used to be under the old rules, anyone could come in and buy property if they had the cash to do it. That was it, though. Unless you had permanent residency or citizenship, you can't get a mortgage, so you had to do an all-cash transaction or find one of maybe two banks in Japan that would loan you the money to buy property, which most of the time just was not going to happen. Let's play the tape.
You might be seeing a lot of headlines right now about foreign buyers in Japan. Words like nationality disclosure, tracking, foreign ownership rules, sometimes even crackdown. And if you're watching this video, there is a good chance a quiet thought has already crossed your mind. Is this the start of a ban? Does this change whether someone like me can still buy? Is Japan about to close the door? Well,
I don't know if they're going to ban it outright like other Asian countries. This is very much an Asian phenomenon. I mean, you go to some place like Vietnam, for example, even their own native population can't own property. You can lease it, do something like a 99-year lease. But yeah, the idea of property ownership, especially if you're a foreigner, forget it. It's not happening. Whereas you go to certain Western countries, even Central and South America, parts of the global South, and their attitude is like, yeah, you got the money, we got the time. Let's make a deal. Asian countries, like, we don't want just anyone buying property here. And we especially don't want wealthy oligarch types coming in and gobbling up property en masse and effectively pricing our own people out of their own country. So a very different attitude in this part of the world.
Let me say this clearly and calmly right at the start. That reaction is understandable. It's also not what's happening. What's coming in 2026 is not a reversal of Japan's property market. And it's not a new rule about who is allowed to buy. It's a change in process, not a change in access. The reason this feels confusing is because headlines tend to collapse a lot of different ideas into one bucket. Nationality, security, foreign investment, residential homes, Akia. Those are not the same thing, but they often get talked about as if they are. So in this video, we're gonna slow this down. We're going to separate what is actually changing, what is not changing, what applies to normal residential buyers and Akia purchasers, and
we're going to make some bloody sense of
large
things.
Scale or sensitive cases that most people will never touch. There's no hype here, no reassurance theater either. Just a clear walkthrough of what's being updated, why it's happening, and how it shows up in a real purchase. Once you understand where this sits in the system, most of the fear drops away on its own. So right here is where a lot of people feel unsettled, even if they can't quite name why. Everything sounds like it's changing, but it's not clear what that actually refers to. And before we touch paperwork or timelines, we need to reset the picture and separate perception from reality. That's where we'll begin. But before we start, be sure to hit the subscribe button. Okay, so let's start by naming the picture a lot of people have in their heads right now. If you've been following this topic through headlines or social media, it can sound like Japan is suddenly tightening the rules on foreign buyers. You'll see language that implies a crackdown, a ban, or the beginning of one, new rules that could apply retroactively. And when those words are stacked together, it's easy to jump into a single conclusion. Something fundamental is changing, and it might affect me. And this is where things start to drift away from reality. Headlines are very good at compressing complex policy into a few charged words. They're much less good at separating what is being measured from what is being restricted. So let's slow this down. The changes being discussed are about nationality disclosure, not eligibility to buy. Those are two very different things.
Okay, so what we're gathering from here now is you have to disclose where you're from, but they're not going to necessarily stop you from buying. That's what I'm getting so far.
Eligibility rules answer the question, who is allowed to own property? Disclosure rules answer the question, what information is recorded when ownership is registered? What's happening in 2026 sits squarely in that second category. So in fact, nationality disclosure already existed in Japan. It just existed unevenly. For a long time, reporting requirements depended on things like whether the purpose was framed as investment or business use, the size of the land, whether the property was near certain sensitive areas, residential purchases, especially single homes and Akia, often passed through a lighter, less consistent version of that system.
Yeah, because it's just houses and some abandoned houses. These are things that, especially if they are part of an Akia housing bank of some sort, or listing of abandoned properties. I mean, think about it. If you're a local municipal government, you've got a list of these old abandoned properties. Someone shows up and they want to buy one of them, or maybe even a handful of them, and they're able to pick them up for a song practically. You're not gonna ask too many hard questions about it. You're just gonna sell them the property, especially if they're bringing in a local estate agent who knows people in the municipal government, or talks with them and communicates with them about these transactions on a regular basis. It all looks on the up and up, and you're not going to ask too many hard questions about it because municipal government is not in the property business. They're in the administrative business, and they've got every incentive to get this sort of thing off their books. So yeah, not too many hard questions. You're glad to get it off your hands. It's somebody else's problem now, not yours.
So what's changing now is that the government is closing those gaps. They're trying to make ownership records more uniform, more centralized, and easier to understand across the entire country.
You'd be amazed how decentralized a lot of these things are across prefectures, across municipalities. It's kind of a clusterfuck in some ways, if you had to put a name on it. Centralizing this does make it a lot more efficient and setting more universal national standards. It's actually kind of a good thing.
Data problem, not a permission problem. And this is the anchor point that's important to keep in mind. Japan has always allowed foreign ownership of real estate. That hasn't changed. There has never been a general rule saying foreigners cannot own homes here. And that rule is not being introduced now.
And it's fairly unique though to this part of the world. As we stated earlier, certain other Southeast Asian countries, they don't let just anybody come in and buy property, if anyone can buy property at all. They place pretty hefty restrictions on that sort of thing. Like, you have to be a citizen. And even then, your ownership is not absolute.
If you're buying a home to live in, a vacation home, or an Akia to restore thoughtfully, you're not suddenly stepping into a different legal category. What is different is how clearly the system wants to know who owns and where. That once you hear that this isn't a ban, the next question usually becomes much more practical. If access isn't changing, then what is? And where does it show up during a real purchase? And that's the right place to focus. And next, we walk through the specific additions calmly and in order so you can see how they actually appear. Now that we've separated headlines from reality, let's talk about what is actually being added. Not in abstract terms, but in terms of what shows up in a real purchase. First change is mandatory nationality declaration at registration. When property ownership is registered in Japan, buyers will be asked to formally declare their nationality. So in practice, this usually means providing a passport or equivalent identification. So this applies even when the property...
No, they're not going to allow just a sort of blind or an anonymous purchase. They want to see that the owner... They want to see who it is that's buying up the property. In so many other Western... I think a lot of this is in response to what we've seen in countries like Canada and Australia, where you've seen Chinese nationals just come in and hoover up properties to get some sort of ethnic foothold in these Western countries and bring them under their thumb, using their own people as weapons, in a sense, another form of unrestricted warfare. I can see Japan adopting these rules where you have to declare your nationality. It's like they're not going to straight up ban Chinese buyers from purchasing properties, but they want to know just who is it that is buying this property? Who are they and where are they from? So that later on, if they do want to restrict property ownership, to say, no, if you are Chinese or Korean or Middle Eastern or Indian or European or American or Canadian, no, you can't just come in and buy property. They're setting up to give themselves the option later on, and believe me, nothing's off the table when it comes to government action. But for right now, they're in an information gathering phase where they want to know who's buying this shit. Where are they from? Oh man, I got the book on unrestricted warfare. Yes, everyone needs to read that. It's an absolute must-read. I got one of the first editions myself. Never got rid of it. I think it's an ebook format somewhere. You might be able to get it on Amazon. Read it. That's all I can say. Read it. You'll understand a lot about what it is that the world is dealing with when it comes to China.
It's for residential use. That includes single-family homes and IKEA. The important timing point here is this. This happens at registration, not when you're browsing listings, not when you make an offer, and not when you sign a purchase agreement.
Yeah, they don't care at that
that
stage.
sits at the back end of the process, handled with your judicial scrivener.
This is when the deal is done. This is when the deal is done and you're registering title and all of that. All that business.
Second change is expanded reporting for overseas buyers.
I mean, anybody can look at property, anybody can shop around for property. They don't care who's looking. They want to know who is buying and who is registering property.
Under the updated framework, foreign nationals who live outside of Japan will be required to report residential purchases, not just business or investment properties. This also applies to Japanese citizens who live abroad. So this isn't about nationality alone.
Got to keep
it's
it equal
about
and fair.
where the buyer is based and how ownership information is recorded. Again,
I mean, it makes sense that they would want to know what Japanese citizens are purchasing abroad, because one of the most effective ways to hide money is still the purchase of real estate. And very often the purchase of real estate in foreign countries. There's a YouTube video of a reading of Unrestricted Warfare. Sid, if you're in the Castle Rexworth Discord, if you wouldn't mind, post that in the... Put it in the news and politics section of the Discord, if you would, please. If you got a link to it. Downloaded a PDF of that book 20 years ago. Should be more widely read, indeed. I probably need to reread it at this stage. It's been years.
this is a reporting step, not an approval step. The third change is that explicit inclusion of residential purchases, including IKEA. So in the past, residential transactions often move through lighter or less standardized reporting channels. So what the government is doing now is bringing those purchases into the same administrative system, so that ownership data is consistent regardless of property type. If you're buying one house or one vacant home, you're not being singled out. You're being folded into a clearer system. The fourth change is standardized, digitalized ownership records. So Japan is in the middle of a long-term effort to modernize land and property data. Different registries, different local practices, and paper-based records have made it hard to see a complete picture. So these changes...
I mean, it's hard enough just figuring out an address for properties. It doesn't matter if it is in the middle of the countryside or in the heart of Tokyo, because they don't have mailing addresses set up the way a lot of other countries in the West do. Your mailing address, especially your numbered portion of your address, is set up according to construction date. But yeah, so much of this, it shows you where Japan is truly lagging behind, is that so much of this is not digitized, so much of this is not easily searchable. It's a highly inefficient system, and yeah, it's about time they caught up to the rest of the world. The next big frontier for all of this, especially title work and legal description, I think would be the application of a blockchain, because I can tell you, having done my fair share of work in commercial real estate, and especially real estate law, even those records that are digitized are still highly imperfect, subject to a lot of errors, and so there can be issues that come up, questions surrounding legal descriptions, actual measurements of plots of land, grey areas on certain easements or little portions, questioning who owns what or who has access to what. All of these equate to cloudy title, and it's one of the worst things that can happen when you're trying to purchase property is any sort of cloudy issues with title. Greatest potential for solving this and possibly reducing or even eliminating the need for things like title insurance can be solved through the introduction of blockchain tech. tying plots of land to something on the blockchain that makes it easier to track its history and much easier to convey property in purchase and sale transactions. I think that's one of the applications where blockchain can be truly revolutionary. And I'm actually surprised that there haven't been more moves towards doing something like that. But also not surprised because we are talking about entrenched bureaucracy that does not like change, and it's just more easier and convenient to turn it into a form of gambling in the form of things like Bitcoin, which, let's face it, a lot of people don't really hold those things as a sort of value or as some sort of safe haven investment. They're just gambling. Where do you say to put it? Yes, news and politics, please.
Support a national database that is more uniform and easier to reconcile. This is one of the main reasons nationality information is being standardized now. Finally, there is that practical side effect that people care about
getting
most.
around
Processing may take slightly longer, especially early on. Anytime new reporting requirement is introduced, legal affairs bureaus and registries need time to adjust. For buyers, that means it's wise to plan for a buffer time around registration and closing, particularly during the first year of implementation. Here's the framing to hold on to. So this is about more forms, not more refusals. And it happens at registration, not at
more
the stage
paperwork
where you decide whether you're allowed to buy. You get it. It's just about reporting, but you have a lingering concern. If there is more paperwork, won't that technically affect who can buy property? That's where assumptions often sneak in. Next, we'll be very clear about what has not changed.
I mean, there's some people that they don't want to deal with it. It's like extra paperwork. Nah, I'm out. Miss me with that. Which, I mean, that's fair. Some people just don't want to deal with that. There are some places in this world that are easier than others to buy property. Japan is one of those that's still kind of stuck in the old ways. A lot of this is fairly standard practice from 30, 40 years ago, whereas many parts of the world have moved on. It is what it is.
The question doesn't sit unanswered. So let's pause here for a moment. When people hear about new disclosure rules, especially anything involving nationality, it is very easy to jump to the wrong conclusion. So before we go any further, I want to be very explicit about what is not changing. So this part matters because overinterpretation is where anxiety hardens into misinformation. So here's the first and most important point. There is no foreign buyer ban. Japan is not closing its property market. There is no new rule that says foreigners can no longer buy homes, land, or Akia. That has not changed. If you were legally allowed to buy property in Japan before, that basic eligibility has not suddenly disappeared. Second, there's no exclusion of residential purchases or Akia purchases. Buying a home to live in, buying a vacation home, buying an Akia to restore and use thoughtfully. So all of that remains legal. These rules do not
use thoughtfully as in to live in it as a primary or secondary residence, or maybe to turn it into a seasonal rental property. That's one thing you have to keep in mind when it comes to things like Airbnb. A lot of neighborhoods have restrictions on that sort of thing in Japan, to where you can only rent it out at certain times of the year. And usually, don't be surprised if they're telling you, oh yeah, you can only rent it out in the off-season. Kind of defeats the purpose, but there it is. However, one needs to do more research on this, so do your own homework. But in previous years, some investors have gotten around that sort of restriction by bringing those properties up to code to where they would qualify for a hotel license. And as long as they qualify and obtain that hotel license and maintain the property according to those standards, then they can rent that out on Airbnb, Booking.com, places like that, and they can do it all year long because they've got the licensing. They've got all the permits to where neighborhood associations, they can't touch them anymore. Now, you run it into the ground and run it like a flop house, then yeah, you're going to lose your hotel license. You're not going to be able to operate it that way. They might even take the property away from you, justifiably so. But as long as you go through the proper channels, do things the right way, there are loopholes.
Wow, residential property and say this category is no longer allowed for foreign buyers. That simply is not what this policy does. Third, and this is important for people who already own property, there are no retroactive penalties. So if you already own a home or land in Japan, there is no new punishment being applied to past purchases.
Some regulations can be made retroactive when it comes to real property in Japan, especially with things like earthquake resistance, mainly because, you know, lives are in the balance, that sort of thing, and they don't want whole structures just crumbling to bits with the next minor tremor that rolls through. So that's understandable. But yeah, definitely one of those pitfalls you have to look out for if you are on the market for property in Japan.
There's no sudden review for old transaction with the goal of taking property away. This is about how information is recorded going forward, not rewriting the past. Fourth, there's no new approval system for typical buyers. You're not being asked to apply for permission from the government to buy a normal home.
If you've got the money, they've got the time.
Deciding whether you personally should be allowed to own a house. For everyday buyers, this remains a registration and reporting process, not an approval process. This is a key distinction, and it often gets lost in headlines. Registration means information is recorded. Approval would mean someone can say no. For typical residential buyers, this change stays firmly in the first category. So if you're watching to this and thinking, okay, but all of that sounds too calm compared to what I've been seeing online, you're not imagining the contrast. A lot of the coverage blurs transparency into restriction language. So that is where fear sneaks in. Here, the boundary is clear. Access has not changed. Eligibility has not changed. What is changing is how ownership information is consistently documented. Once it's clear that everyday buyers aren't being targeted, another question naturally follows. If nothing fundamental is being taken away, why do this now? That curiosity makes sense. In the next section, we'll slow things down and look at timing and motivation without drifting into politics or housing fear. So let's talk about timing. If nothing fundamental is being taken away from everyday buyers, then why is this happening now? Why 2026 and not 10 years ago? This is where headlines often drift into politics.
Everything moves
where
slow
confusion tends to grow. So let's slow things down and keep it grounded in how systems actually work. Okay, so here's a key point. This is primarily a data problem. For a long time, Japan's land and property records have been fragmented. Different rules applied, depending on who you were, where you lived, what kind of property it was, and how it was purchased. Some foreign ownership was tracked carefully. Some was not. Some residential purchases were recorded one way, others another way. Over time,
it really just depended on where you went.
That created gaps. Not because someone was hiding things, because the system itself was inconsistent. Now, zoom out a little. Japan, like many countries, is trying to align its land ownership records with international transparency standards. This is about being able to answer very basic questions at a national level. Who owns what? Where ownership is domestic or overseas? How land...
I can imagine that this makes certain areas, certain prefectures, certain municipalities more desirable to deal with than others. Because you know that there are some that are just an absolute delight to deal with, especially if you're dealing with international buyers. And then there are some that you will steer all of your international clients away from and say, don't even bother, they are a nightmare to deal with. Just on the record keeping alone. Yeah, this is what he's describing, I think, is long overdue. Highly inefficient systems. So much as we rail against globalism and whatnot, bringing it up to international standards like this and harmonizing across the entire country and making a system that is similar to what you see in other countries around the world, yeah, I welcome that sort of thing.
Is actually being used, and
but I'm also biased because the dream is to own some property in Japan. I'd love to have a little retirement cottage or something like that in Hokkaido, someplace, anywhere.
Now, the government cannot answer those questions clearly without fixing the underlying data. This connects directly to the digital agency's modernization goals. Japan is in the middle of a long transition toward unified, digitalized registries. Land, buildings, ownership
bloody
use.
time.
This has been slow and sometimes messy, but it has been moving in one direction for years. Real estate ends up inside this process not because homes are the problem, but because land records are part of the system that needs updating. And this is where another misunderstanding shows up. People assume real estate is the main target. In reality, it's often the reference point. The deeper focus of these reforms is on large-scale, indirect, or strategic holdings, corporate ownership, complex investment structures, land tied to sensitive use or infrastructure. Residential property gets included not because individual buyers are concerned, but because excluding it leaves holes in the data. Consistency means more than category. So instead of saying only track this type of property, but not that one, the system moves toward record the same basic information for everyone. That is why residential purchases, including IKEA, are part of the update. Not to single them out, but to stop treating them as exceptions. Now, if you step back, this starts to look less like a housing policy shift and more like administrative catch-up. All of that explains the background. But most people don't buy policy, they buy homes. So the real question becomes where this shows up when you're actually purchasing.
The policy, though, is what influences the buying of homes. But he's right. People don't buy policy, they buy homes.
On paper, in sequence, in real time. And that is what we'll walk through next. Now, let's bring this out of policy language into a real purchase. When people hear nationality disclosure, it can sound abstract. So let's walk through where this actually shows up and where it doesn't. First, the most important orientation. This does not happen at the viewing stage. It does not happen when you make an offer. It does not happen during price negotiation. You're not being interviewed. No one's asking you to explain your intent, your background, or your long-term plans. This comes later. For a typical residential or IKEA purchase, nationality disclosure appears during ownership registration. This is the moment when the property is formally recorded under your name at the Legal Affairs Bureau. At this stage, the judicial scrivener, the shihoshoshi, prepares the registration documents. This is already standard in Japan. What changes under the new rules is that nationality information is explicitly included and standardized. So what does that look like in practice? So for most buyers, it means providing a copy of your passport, your full legal name as it appears on that document, basic identifying information that matches the registration forms. If you're a resident of Japan, that is usually combined with the information already on file, such as your address. If you're a non-resident buyer, there may be one additional reporting step because overseas ownership is now tracked more consistently.
Don't know why, but I can't see news and politics in Discord. Is it because I'm new? No, I don't think that has anything to do with it. Sometimes you have to click the check mark under the Cost of Exworth name in that main sidebar to show all channels. Sometimes it gets hidden like that. But it is under the real life section, which is close to the bottom. But yeah, make sure that you have it clicked to show all channels. That should fix the problem. But yeah, if not, let me know or talk to one of the mods. You know, let them see what they can do.
That step is administrative. It is not a review of whether you should be allowed to buy. It is a record that the buyer lives outside Japan at the time of purchase. The important thing to understand is who handles this. You are not personally submitting forms to a government office on your own. Like I said, the judicial scrivener handles the registration. The registry processes it. Your role is to provide accurate documents when requested. This is why working with professionals who regularly handle foreign buyers matters. Not because the rules are dangerous, but because they know where this information fits into the process and when it is required. And one more point that often gets misunderstood. This is paperwork, not evaluation. No one is scoring you. No one is deciding whether your reason for buying is acceptable. The system is recording ownership information, not judging buyers. For most people watching this, the experience will feel very familiar. You provide documents, the professional files them. The registration is a process. It may involve 1 or 2 extra forms compared to the past, but the structure of the transaction stays the same. As soon as people hear additional reporting,
Okay.
timing is usually the next worry. Does this slow things down or make closing unpredictable? That concern is understandable. Next, we'll talk about where friction actually appears early on and how to plan for it without assuming something is wrong. So this is usually where anxiety shows up. People hear extra reporting and the mind jumps straight to delays, stalled closings, unexpected problems. So let's talk honestly about timing. Here's a key point. Early implementation is almost always slower. Not because buyers are being scrutinized, but because systems are adjusting. New forms, new checklists, staff learning where information lives and how it connects. This happens anytime Japan updates administrative processes.
There's always going to be a learning curve.
Level. So where is friction most likely? The most common slowdown point is ownership registration, not contract signing. The Legal Affairs Bureau may take a bit longer to process filings that include new disclosure fields, especially in the first months after rollout. For non-resident buyers, the additional reporting step can also add time if documents need to be verified or formatted differently. None of this stops a transaction. It just stretches certain steps slightly. What this does not usually affect: property viewing, price negotiation, signing the purchase contract, paying the deposit. Those parts of the process stay the same.
He's talking about things that are on the very tail end of any sort of real property transaction. So yeah, makes sense. Let's see here. Okay, we will go ahead and I think stop with this one. I'm not going to watch the whole thing. We are going to move on to something else.